We have one remaining with the individual, and he's not going to let her leave the aircraft at this time.
He made me feel very sure that we had a very real and horrifying threat.
We don't know who he was, where he came from, or where he went.
For the past 2 years, Dan Gryder has made claims to have found D.B. Cooper's parachute in a barn in North Carolina once owned by the mother of Cooper copycat Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. For Cooper researchers like myself, it didn't take long for us to spot the numerous ways that this chute did not match the description of Cooper's parachute that is contained within the FBI's investigative files. We have around 45,000 pages of these files at this point, and they are a tremendous asset to Cooper researchers. Of course, the overwhelming majority of those files aren't about the parachutes that Cooper was given that night, but there are quite a few. Before we dig into those files, which indicate to me that this is unquestionably not D.B. Cooper's rig, let's look at why Dan believes that this is Cooper's parachute rig.
When the hijacking occurred, they went to the sports center and asked for a rigger. They wanted 2 backs and 2 chest parachutes. Earl was on duty. His name was Earl Cossey. You're going to hear that name a lot. Earl Cossey is referenced, and Bruce Smith did a nice job of documenting exactly what Earl told him as far as what he supplied that night. That defines what it is that we're looking for, and basically this parachute that we're looking for is an extremely highly modified military factory bailout rig, a factory rig that's now been modified by an individual.
So we see there that Dan's belief is based on what Earl Cossey, a skydiver and parachute rigger, told author Bruce Smith in 2009. In one of his videos, Dan puts up this graphic which states that the FBI records show that the rig used by Cooper was modified by Earl Cossey to include, number 1, cape wells, number 2, that the ripcord handle was moved to the right side, and 3, that the pack tray was enlarged to hold larger chutes with deployment sleeves. I personally know of no FBI records that indicate such a thing, none whatsoever. In fact, the actual FBI records show quite the opposite, and we'll get into that now. As we move into the discussion of the FBI's actual documentation as to what Cooper's parachutes were or were not, I want you all to understand that this is not a personal attack on Dan. He's a busy guy, no doubt. He has a YouTube channel with over 100,000 subscribers, and he produces long-form content that people out there clearly enjoy. So with everything going on in his life, I doubt that he has the time to comb through thousands of these FBI documents from the early 70s and to arrange them into a searchable database, which is what I have nerdily been doing for the past several years. So again, this isn't an attack on Dan, but more so just a cautionary tale about the pitfalls that may occur when a researcher relies on word-of-mouth testimony from someone decades after an event took place. I think the most important thing to immediately clear up is this idea that Earl Cossey was on duty the night of the hijacking at Issaquah Sky Sports and that he supplied the parachutes. This simply isn't the case. One of the earliest documents we have in the FBI files describes that 2 chest pack parachutes or reserve chutes were obtained from Lynn Emmerich, the owner of Seattle Sky Sports. These 2 chest packs were transported by the Washington State Patrol to SeaTac and were actually the last items of Cooper's ransom to arrive at the airport, showing up around 5 p.m. A few days after the hijacking, Emmerich was interviewed by a local paper, the Issaquah Press, and he detailed how the Washington Aeronautic Commission contacted him requesting 4 parachutes for 2 hijackers, which was an assumption since the hijacker had requested 2 sets of parachutes. Anyways, they later told Emmerich that the backpacks had been secured elsewhere and he only needed to provide chest packs. Emmerich said that he knew he'd never get them back again, so he gave them 2 crummy old chest packs that he had laying around, one of which turned out to be non-functional. So we can see there that using the FBI's original documents and also contemporary interviews with Lynn Emmerich that it was he and not Cossey who was there that night. So Cossey didn't supply any of the parachutes during the hijacking and certainly didn't give over one of his own rigs. This erroneous story that Cossey told author Bruce Smith is really the sole information that Dan is relying on to make the case that this is D.B. Cooper's parachute rig that he found. If the FBI files and contemporary news interviews show that Cossey did not supply any of his backpacks to the FBI that night, then where did the actual backpack parachute that Cooper used for his jump come from? It came from a local stunt pilot named Norman Hayden. Following a series of phone calls where Northwest Orient employees were scrambling and looking for backpacks, somebody remembered that Norman Hayden had a pair. Hayden gets a phone call about this situation unfolding at SeaTac, and he eventually just gets a taxi cab to transport these parachutes to the airport. Hayden's 2 backpack parachutes are roughly the same, both being emergency military bailout rigs, with one being a tan color and the other a greenish color. Cooper ended up jumping with this green one. Hayden, being the supplier of the backpack parachutes, was known not just to the FBI, but also to the media right from the start. 2 days after the hijacking, on November 26th, the Seattle Post-Intelligencer wrote, "Along with the 2 chest pack chutes from Sky Sports, located in Issaquah, the hijacker was provided with 2 backpack chutes by Norman Hayden of Renton Aviation." So again, we see that despite what he said almost 4 decades after the fact, Earl Cossey did not supply the backpacks given to Cooper. If we needed any more evidence that the backpacks taken aboard Flight 305 were Norman Hayden's, we've got a slew of documents in the FBI files where Hayden is negotiating with the FBI for either reimbursement or the return of the backpack that Cooper left on the plane. So where does Cossey even come into this story if these were not his backpacks? Back in May 1971, Hayden was required by a new law to have as many parachutes in his stunt plane as there were seats in the plane. So he ended up contacting Cossey to furnish him with 2 backpacks. As the person who originally rigged the backpack that Cooper received, the FBI went looking for Cossey to get more detailed information about these parachutes that he supplied Hayden back in May. So how did Cossey describe the parachute that Cooper jumped with? He says that it was an emergency backpack, an MB6 with a harness that had no D-rings. So let's talk about those D-rings, or the lack thereof. Parachute harnesses will often have these metal pieces called D-rings, which are used to attach a chest pack reserve parachute to the backpack. That way, when a skydiver jumps, they'll have their backpack, which is their main chute, but also their reserve chute attached to their chest that they can deploy if needed. These D-rings are quite noticeable on the parachute that Dan found in North Carolina. That alone should knock this parachute out of contention as being Cooper's. Dan interviewed me several months ago on his show, and I mentioned to him that Cooper was allegedly complaining about the lack of D-rings on his parachute, and I wondered how he could reconcile that with the fact that the rig he found has D-rings on it. This was his response.
D-rings. The question keeps on coming up about D-rings. I'm going to tell you, D-rings are the things that go on a sport parachute's front canopy for the purpose of attaching a belly-mounted reserve. Any military bailout rig does not have a D-ring. So if it's got a D-ring and it's a bailout rig, it's obviously been modified. I did this little interview with my friend Mel Tilley out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. He explains what the problem is. He shows you what a belly chest reserve would look like, and we go through and step through and shows you exactly what the problem would have been that night. The jumper has this leather strewn satchel thing with all the money in it, but there's no way to clip it to himself. He's got a rig that's got D-rings on it, but the satchel that he has been presented with has no physical means of securely attaching it to himself for his proposed night jump.
So Dan's contention is that Cooper's complaint was actually about the money bag and that his harness did in fact have D-rings. But that's just not the case. Within the FBI files and early newspaper interviews with folks like Cossey and Hayden himself, we can read that Cooper's chute clearly didn't have these D-rings, and it was something that was discussed quite frequently. On November 26, 1971, just 2 days after the hijacking, both Cossey and Emmerich are interviewed by the Seattle Post-Intelligencer about the parachutes. The article reads, in part, "The backpacks obtained from Renton Aviation did not have these D-rings. Earl Cossey, 30, of Seattle, who made the backpack chutes, confirmed this." On the same day, the Columbian has an interview with Cossey where he states the same thing and says that the chest packs Cooper was given could not have fastened onto the backpack. Hence, lack of D-rings. The FBI files are full of corroborating evidence to this as well. Here we have Earl Cossey again telling the FBI that the backpacks given to Cooper did not have the necessary hooks on the harness to attach a chest pack. In another example, we've got Norman Hayden himself giving an interview to the FBI in 1973 stating that the 2 parachutes he loaned the hijacker, loaned is a cute word for it, had no hooks on which to fasten a chest pack. On and on it goes in the FBI's internal files. There are just no D-rings on that harness. Speaking of the harness, there is another feature that Dan's parachute has that we know from the FBI's files Cooper's did not have. Throughout the FBI's investigation, people would often bring various pieces of parachuting equipment and turn these into the FBI thinking that they might have something to do with the D.B. Cooper hijacking. The FBI in Seattle would usually show these to Cossey, and he would always reject them for a variety of reasons, such as having the aforementioned D-rings. Another reason that he rejected some of these rigs is because they had cape wells on them, which Dan's parachute has. Cape wells are quick-release mechanisms that can be used to quickly get rid of the canopy if something is going wrong and you need to deploy your chest reserve. This document from June 1972 is illustrative of Cossey rejecting a parachute harness because it has these cape wells. So, Dan's parachute already has two major problems with it: D-rings and cape wells. In addition to those issues, Cossey repeatedly referred to the backpack back in 1971 as an NB6, which stands for Navy Backpack Model 6. But the harness on Dan's chute comes from an Air Force rig, not a Navy rig. One of the easiest ways to spot the difference in a Navy harness and an Air Force harness on parachutes on these older bailout rigs are the chest fasteners. Navy backpacks had fasteners that slid up and down the harness, which meant that they were always going to be hooked up to the middle of your chest. Air Force harnesses also slid up and down, but they are connected to the harness by this dedicated piece of webbing. You can see the difference. So the harness on Dan's chute is Air Force. Yet another strike against it. And if somebody was needing even more evidence that the 1971 description of the chutes that went on the plane was accurate, we have the chute Cooper left on the plane that was recovered. This eventually made its way back to Norman Hayden and is currently in the Washington State History Museum. And wouldn't you know, it's a standard, boring military bailout rig just like Cossey described that he gave Hayden. And we know that this is indeed one of the two that Cossey made for Hayden because of the packing card, which is signed by Cossey on the date that Hayden received them back in May 1971. So really, what is the more likely source for an accurate description of the parachute that Cooper jumped with? On the one hand, we have Cossey on the record telling the FBI numerous times about the provenance of the parachute, that it came from Hayden, and we have him on record repeatedly describing the parachute in the exact same way over and over and over again. This is just a sample of the documents from after the hijacking where Cossey, Hayden, Emmerich, or the FBI themselves state things that are totally contradictory to Dan's parachute. Yet on the other hand, Dan's entire belief is based on a statement that Cossey made to Bruce Smith in 2009. Cossey also told this same demonstrably bogus story to Agent Larry Carr in 2008. The ironic thing is that Dan's chute doesn't even match the erroneous description either. Cossey, even when falsely claiming it was his highly modified rig that Cooper jumped with, referred to it variously as an NB6 or NB8, and Dan's harness is definitely not a Navy harness. To reiterate what I said earlier, this isn't an attack on Dan personally. I just don't think he was aware that we have the original documentation now thanks to the newly released investigative files that were obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. Hopefully he can accept the original evidence and doesn't resort to suggesting that all these modifications happened at some later date after the Cooper hijacking. Even if we presume that McCoy was indeed Cooper, is he really going to keep evidence from a capital crime and his belongings as a souvenir? And then he's going to take this souvenir from his capital crime to a master parachute rigger to have all these modifications done to it? Nah, come on. A few other odds and ends to get to before I wrap this up. Remember earlier when Dan was suggesting that Cooper was mad because the bag didn't have D-rings? Dan calls this a leather satchel. This is derived from a statement that Bill Radachek, the co-pilot of Flight 305, has made in recent years. Yet again, Dan finds himself entirely relying on decades-old memories instead of the evidence from the event itself. First and foremost, Radachek is almost certainly not an eyewitness. The cockpit door was barely cracked the entire time, and Radachek never left his post in the co-pilot's chair. What he's likely remembering is some radio chatter describing the money arriving at the airport. In a document written on the night of the hijacking, Special Agent in charge of the Seattle office, J. Earl Milne, described the money arriving at the airport carried by two bank security officers. Milne states, they carried a white canvas bag that they advised contained $200,000 in $20 denominations. The bag was encased in a large leather satchel. The bag was removed from the leather satchel and the seal on it was cut by Mr. Grinnell. End quote. This bag was then taken to the plane by Al Lee, a pilot for Northwest. He handed it to stewardess Tina Mucklow, who then took it aboard the plane. In her statements to the FBI, Mucklow described dragging a white canvas bag down the aisle to where the hijacker was sitting. She later states that he was complaining because he wanted the bag in a knapsack, but in her words, it was delivered in a cloth bank-type bag. Passenger Jack Olmsted described it as looking like a pillowcase with bricks in it. Cooper then took this cloth money bag and wrapped it up with parachute cord that he had cut from one of the reserves, wrapping it a few times from top to bottom and making a loop like a handle at the top. Cooper then tied this bag to another length of shroud line which he wrapped around his waist. Something else I wanted to point out about Dan's latest video. He writes at the beginning that the FBI has never collected any new DNA in association with the Cooper case since 2001. As I've said, we have the FBI files now, and this just simply isn't accurate information. The FBI collected DNA from several sources since 2001. They collected it from Sheridan Peterson in 2003, from suspect Jason Langseth in 2004. They collected Barb Dayton's DNA in 2006, Kenny Christensen's in 2007, L.D. Cooper's in 2010, and Wolfgang Gossett's in 2011. As for McCoy, I have an entire video on my channel dedicated to his own hijacking in April 1972, and also all of the reasons why he was most certainly not D.B. Cooper. I'll link that video below. Chief among these reasons why McCoy wasn't Cooper was that the chief eyewitnesses to Cooper all said that he wasn't their hijacker. Tina Mucklow, who spent around 5 hours with Cooper, and the other stewardesses stated definitively that he was not the man who hijacked their plane. They were even able to point out specific differences between the two men. Nevertheless, if you still want to believe that McCoy was Cooper despite the mountain of evidence that the FBI collected suggesting otherwise, then that's fine. It's just an opinion. But something that goes beyond mere opinion and into the realm of fact is that Dan Gryder's parachute was not the parachute that D.B. Cooper used that night. I honestly don't know how it can be defended once someone is supplied with all of this historical evidence from 1971. Anyways, that's all I've got for now, so like and subscribe and all that YouTube-y stuff. I will talk to you guys again soon. Bye.